The cargo hold of the mercenary vessel Black Dagger reeked of oil, sweat, and the lingering metallic scent of old blood. The overhead lights flickered in rhythmic intervals, casting long, jagged shadows across the metal floor. Captain Raska paced with slow, deliberate steps, his boots thudding against the grated floor as he studied their newest acquisition, a human woman, bound to a steel chair in the center of the room. She was an anomaly. Most prisoners, when dragged aboard the Black Dagger, reacted in predictable ways, screaming, sobbing, or bargaining for their freedom. Fear was a scent Raska and his crew were intimately familiar with, a stench that clung to every living being they captured. But this woman? She wasn't afraid. Her dark eyes were calm, almost curious, as she watched the group of heavily armed mercenaries surrounding her. Her face was free of tension, no trembling lips or panicked breaths. If anything, she looked slightly amused, like she was waiting for them to realize some obvious mistake. And that set Raska on edge. "Speak," he ordered, his voice a low growl. The woman exhaled softly, tilting her head as if considering the demand. When she finally spoke, her voice was smooth, quiet, and eerily confident. "You shouldn't have taken me." Grenth, a massive reptilian brute with scaled green skin and jagged teeth, snorted and crossed his arms. "Oh, is that so?" he sneered, stepping forward. His hulking form dwarfed the woman, his breath reeking of raw meat. "And what are you gonna do, little human?" She didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. "Not me," she said simply. "But they will." A hush fell over the room. Raska narrowed his eyes. "Who is they?" The woman didn't answer. She simply smiled. That smile sent an unfamiliar sensation crawling up Raska's spine, something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. "We should space her now," muttered Dravik, the ship's weapons expert, shifting uncomfortably. "Humans aren't supposed to act like this." Raska didn't respond. His gaze remained locked on the woman, studying her like a puzzle he hadn't quite solved. Her clothes were unremarkable, just a simple dark jumpsuit, no insignia, no weapons. Her wrists were restrained with high-voltage cuffs designed to hold creatures twice her size, but she didn't struggle against them. She didn't even look concerned. That's what bothered him the most. Raska had spent years raiding ships across the outer colonies, taking hostages, eliminating threats. He knew how people reacted to captivity. He had seen trained soldiers break down after just a few hours in his custody. This woman didn't break. She didn't even bend. Raska stepped closer, leaning down until his face was just inches from hers. He wanted to see if he could catch a flicker of fear, some hint of hesitation. Instead, she looked straight into his eyes and whispered, "You don't have much time left." A metallic clunk echoed through the room. The lights overhead flickered again, this time longer. "Captain," came a sharp voice over the ship's comm system. It was Vorek, their navigator. "We're picking up," static cut off his words, followed by a screeching distortion that made the entire crew wince. Raska straightened, pressing a finger to his earpiece. "Vorek? What's happening?" More static. Then, faintly, something else. A whisper. Not words, just sound. Like something breathing just beyond the range of comprehension. A cold chill spread through Raska's gut. "Report," he barked. Silence. He turned back to the woman. She was still watching him, still smiling that same knowing smile. "You should let me go," she said softly. Grenth growled, frustration evident in his tense posture. "Enough games." He reached down and grabbed her by the collar, lifting her from the chair with inhuman strength. "Tell us what the hell is going on before I—" The ship lurched. Alarms blared. A deep, groaning sound reverberated through the hull, as if something enormous had just passed by. Grenth stumbled, dropping the woman back into her seat. What the hell was that? Dravik snapped, pulling his blaster from its holster. Raska ignored him, activating the ship-wide comms. "Bridge, report." This time, the response came through. But it wasn't Vorek. It was a whisper. The same one they had heard through the static, but louder now. More distinct. And it was inside the ship. Raska's blood turned to ice. Something was here. The woman let out a soft sigh, shaking her head. "I told you," she murmured. "You shouldn't have taken me." A scream echoed from the corridor just outside the cargo hold. A sharp, guttural cry that cut off far too suddenly. Dravik and Grenth snapped their weapons up, pointing them toward the door. The metal panels hissed slightly, as if something was pressing against them from the other side. A thump. Then another. Raska's grip tightened around his own blaster. He turned back to the woman, his voice deadly calm. "What did you bring onto my ship?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes darker than before. "You were never alone," she whispered. "They've been waiting." Another scream. This time, closer. The lights above flickered again, once, twice, before plunging the room into complete darkness. And in the pitch black, something moved. Something breathed. Raska heard a wet, slithering sound, followed by a sharp gasp of pain from Dravik. He spun in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. No. Not nothing. Shadows shifting where there shouldn't be shadows. Then, just as suddenly as they had gone out, the lights flickered back on. Dravik was gone. His blaster lay on the floor, but there was no sign of him. No blood. No body. Just emptiness. Raska's stomach twisted. He turned back to the woman, but this time, his voice held something it had never held before. Fear. What? Ah. They? The woman exhaled slowly, as if savoring the moment. Then, she leaned back in her chair, smiling once more. "They don't have a name," she said. "Not one you'd understand." The ship shuddered again, and this time, Raska swore he heard something laughing in the walls. The woman tilted her head. "But they do have a hunger." And as the lights flickered again, the whispers grew louder. The Black Dagger was no longer a mercenary ship. It was a hunting ground. The ship's emergency lights pulsed in erratic intervals, casting the corridors in fleeting moments of blood-red illumination. The Black Dagger was a vessel built for war, thick hull plating, reinforced bulkheads, and a weapons cache capable of reducing planets to smoldering husks. And yet, at that moment, Captain Raska felt as if his ship were nothing more than a drifting tomb. Dravik was gone. One moment he had been there, weapon raised, breath sharp with tension. The next, vanished. No scream, no struggle. Just the cold silence of his absence. And the whispering. It slithered through the comms, through the walls, through Raska's mind. It was a sound that didn't belong, something that existed between the moments, as if the ship itself had begun to breathe. Raska turned toward the woman still seated in the cargo hold. She remained unnervingly composed, bound by restraints that should have made her vulnerable. And yet, she wasn't. "What the hell is happening?" Raska demanded, voice edged with fury and something dangerously close to fear. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him as though deciding whether or not to grant him an answer. Then, finally, she said, "They've found you." A deep, guttural thump reverberated from somewhere within the ship, rattling the metal plating beneath their feet. The sound wasn't mechanical. It wasn't something that should be heard in a vessel like this. It was organic, primal, like the heartbeat of something vast and unseen. Grenth bared his jagged teeth. "Enough of this." He turned, raising his massive clawed hand, and slammed it against the woman's face. Or at least, he tried to. The moment before impact, something shifted. The air around her shimmered, a distortion so subtle it might have been mistaken for a trick of the light. Grentha's blow stopped inches from her face, his hand frozen in place as if caught in invisible tar. Then, in a single, impossible motion, he was pulled backward. Raska barely had time to react before Grentha's body was yanked off his feet and hurled across the room. He hit the far wall with a sickening crunch and crumpled to the floor, unmoving. The woman didn't even blink. "Don't touch me," she murmured. A low, keening wail filled the room, not from Grenth, but from the walls themselves. The ship groaned, metal bending in ways it shouldn't. Then, from the ceiling vent, something long and black dripped downward. Raska moved before he could think, firing his blaster at the anomaly. The bolt of plasma struck true, illuminating the thing for the briefest of moments. It was a shadow. Not a trick of light, not a mere absence of illumination. A living, writhing thing that flickered in and out of perception like a half-formed thought. The moment the plasma touched it, the entity screeched, a sound that wasn't heard so much as felt, vibrating through bone and memory. Then, just as quickly, it recoiled and vanished into the vent. The whispering grew louder. "They don't like being seen," the woman remarked. Raska turned toward her, gun still raised. "What are they?" The woman exhaled, slow and deliberate. "They are the silent ones. They exist between perception. Between the spaces where light does not reach. They have no shape, no form, only hunger." Another thump reverberated through the ship. Louder this time. "They've been watching your crew since you took me," she continued. "They would have stayed in the walls, in the vents, waiting, but you made a mistake." Raska's grip on his blaster tightened. "What mistake?" The woman smiled, slow and knowing. "You noticed them." Something slammed against the corridor outside, hard enough to dent the metal. The doors buckled inward, groaning under the force. Raska and the remaining mercenaries snapped their weapons toward the entrance. Bridge. Raska barked into his comms. I need a status report, now. Static. Then, Vorek's voice, raw with panic, Captain, oh, gods, it's in here. The transmission cut to silence. The door to the cargo hold ripped open. And then the lights failed completely. In the suffocating darkness, Raska heard it. A whisper, no longer distant but right beside him, curling through the air like cold breath against his ear. You were never alone. A shot rang out, blast of fire illuminating the room for the briefest instant. Raska saw something, a void in the shape of a man, tall and thin, with too many limbs that shifted as though unfixed in time. Then the light vanished, and so did the thing. A scream erupted to his left. He turned, firing blindly, but hit nothing. When the lights flickered back, another crew member was gone. Raska forced himself to breathe. To think. His crew was being picked off one by one, and he was next. He turned toward the woman again, voice low and dangerous. How do I stop this? She studied him, then slowly, deliberately, lifted her still-bound hands. Let me go. The ship shuddered as something massive moved beyond the hull. The walls trembled as though something vast and unseen was brushing against them. Raska hesitated. The woman leaned forward. They came for me, she whispered. But they will take you instead if you keep me here. Another deep, thunderous thump. And then a choice. He could keep her locked up and watch his crew vanish one by one. Or he could let her go, and pray it was enough to make them leave. His fingers hovered over the restraints. Another scream. Another absence where there had once been life. Raska made his decision. With a single movement, he unlocked her cuffs. The woman stood, stretching her fingers as if shaking off invisible chains. The moment she did, the whispering stopped. The ship held its breath. And then, for the first time, the shadows began to retreat. The woman smiled. Smart choice. She walked toward the airlock. Raska followed, uncertain whether he had saved himself or doomed them all. As she reached the threshold, she turned back to him, her gaze unreadable. They won't forget you, Captain. And with that, she stepped into the void. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the shadows followed her, peeling away from the walls, from the vents, from the corners where they had waited. The ship's lights flickered back to life. The air was still. The silent ones were gone. But Raska knew, deep in his bones. They had never truly left. Silence. For the first time since they had taken the woman aboard, the black dagger was still. The flickering lights had stabilized, the hull had stopped shuddering, and the oppressive weight of unseen eyes had seemingly lifted. But Captain Raska didn't trust it. He stood frozen at the airlock where the woman had stepped into the void, his mind replaying her last words. They won't forget you, Captain. The shadows had followed her, retreating like a tide pulled back into the abyss. But something felt wrong. The ship was too quiet. Too empty. He turned, scanning the dimly lit corridor. Grenth lay slumped against the wall where he had been thrown earlier, unconscious but breathing. Other than that, the cargo hold was deserted. Dravik. Vorek. The rest of the crew. Gone. Not dead. Not wounded. Just, missing. Raska had seen death before, burned bodies, punctured skulls, vaporized flesh. But this was something worse. This was absence, the kind that made his stomach knot in a way it never had before. Grenth, he barked, his voice a sharp contrast to the eerie quiet. Get up. The reptilian merc groaned, his thick fingers twitching before he forced himself upright. He winced, rubbing the back of his head where he had hit the bulkhead. What? He paused, blinking blearily at the empty room. Where the hell is everyone? Raska didn't answer. Because he didn't know. A deep, involuntary instinct told him that searching for them would be a mistake. That if he tried to understand what had happened, the answer would look back at him. And he would vanish too. Instead, he activated his wristcom bridge, respond. Silence. He swallowed hard. Engineering, report. Static. Grenth shifted beside him, his large frame unusually tense. This doesn't make sense, Captain, he muttered. Even if something attacked the crew, where are the bodies? There should be blood. There should be something. Raska's jaw tightened. There was something. Grenth turned toward him. What? Raska exhaled, rubbing his temple. The woman called them the Silent Ones. She said they existed between perception. Between the places light doesn't touch. Grenth snorted. You believe that mystic garbage? Raska didn't answer right away. He had spent years in the lawless sectors of the galaxy, working as a killer, a raider, a predator among predators. He believed in power, in weapons, in things he could see and control. But the Black Dagger wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was something else. Something hunted. He glanced toward the airlock again. The woman said they came for her, he murmured. But they'll remember us. Grenth was about to reply when the lights flickered. Not in the same erratic way as before. This was different. The corridor ahead of them darkened, but it wasn't just the absence of light, it was the presence of something else. The shadows moved. Grenth saw it too. His nostrils flared, and he pulled his sidearm with a quick, practiced motion. No, he muttered, shaking his head. No way. They left. We saw them go. Raska wasn't sure he believed that anymore. He took a slow step back. The shadows ahead deepened, growing impossibly dark, stretching toward them. The space seemed to ripple, bending like heat waves on a desert horizon. A whisper. Not words. Just sound. Raska grabbed Grenth by the shoulder. Run. Grenth hesitated, but then he saw what Raska saw. The shadows weren't staying in the corridor anymore. They were creeping toward them, consuming the metal floor, the walls, the air itself. They ran. Down the hall, past the empty crew quarters, through the desolate mess hall. Every door they passed slid shut behind them as if the ship itself were trying to keep the darkness at bay. Raska didn't question it. They reached the bridge and slammed the doors shut behind them. Raska activated the override lock, sealing the entrance. He turned to face what should have been his command center, only to find it empty. No bodies. No blood. Just empty seats, abandoned stations, and the faint smell of something wrong. Grenth panted beside him, his claws gripping his blaster like a lifeline. I don't get it, he rasped. We were fine when the woman left. The things followed her. So why are they still here? Raska clenched his jaw. Because they remember us. He turned toward the main console, hands flying over the controls. The ship's systems flickered, struggling to respond, as if something unseen was interfering. But one thing was clear. The ship was moving. Grenth noticed it too. We're drifting, he muttered, eyes narrowing at the viewport. The stars outside weren't static, they were shifting, as if the Black Dagger had begun a slow, involuntary descent. Then they saw it. A shape in the void. Not a ship. Not a planet. Something else. It was vast, stretching beyond the limits of comprehension, its edges indistinct, shifting between solid and not. A thing that had no name, no form that the mind could properly grasp. And it was waiting. The Black Dagger was being pulled toward it, drawn in like an insect into an unseen web. Grenth took a slow step back. Tell me you can get us out of here. Raska's fingers moved faster over the console. He rerouted power to the thrusters, but the engines sputtered, failing before they could even engage. The ship wanted to move, but something held it back. Something unseen. Something hungry. The whispering returned, curling through the bridge, pressing against their ears. This time, it was clearer. Closer. You were never alone. Raska's blood ran cold. The air in the room shifted, and suddenly, Grenth wasn't there. Raska didn't see him vanish. There was no sound, no movement. 1 second, his presence was beside him, the weight of his breath, the scent of his skin. And then there was nothing. Only Raska. Alone. A sharp exhale rattled from his chest. His fingers trembled over the controls, but deep down, he knew. This wasn't a battle he could win. This wasn't something he could fight. His ship was gone. His crew was gone. And soon, he would be too. The whispering grew louder. The shadows closed in. Then, in the very last moment before the darkness consumed him, he saw her. The woman. Standing in the void beyond the viewport, her figure still and watching. Her lips moved. He couldn't hear her words. But he understood. And then the Black Dagger, and everyone who had ever stepped aboard it, was no more. Nothing. No ship. No crew. No sound. Just absence. Raska existed, or at least, he thought he did. But there was no floor beneath him, no air to breathe, no sensation of body or weight. He was somewhere, and yet, nowhere at all. For the first time in his life, he was completely, utterly powerless. Then, the whispering returned. Not just one voice this time, but many. A chorus of sounds that wove together, filling the vast emptiness. They spoke in a language that wasn't words but meaning, direct, raw, undeniable. You do not belong. Raska turned, if turning was even possible. His body, or the idea of his body, shifted, and suddenly, he was seeing. The black dagger was there, but it wasn't a ship anymore. It was something twisted, its form stretched and distorted, like an echo of its former self. The hull was cracked, its edges dissolving into black mist. The corridors, once a maze of steel, now spiraled into infinite, impossible directions. It was a vessel caught between existence and oblivion. And then he saw them. The Silent Ones. They moved without form, gliding through the ruins of the black dagger, consuming everything they touched. Shadows without shape, voices without faces. They were not creatures, not beings. They were concepts, living between the seconds, feasting on what should not be. Raska realized the truth in a slow, dawning horror. They weren't attacking the ship. They were undoing it. Everything the black dagger had ever been, every scar from battle, every moment of violence, every breath taken within its halls, was being unraveled, thread by thread, memory by memory. And Raska was next. You should not be. The words were not a threat. They were fact. He felt them reach into him, pulling at the essence of who he was. Every moment of his life flickered before him, his first kill, his rise to captain, the countless bodies left in his wake. He had always believed himself untouchable, the predator in the dark. But now, the dark had come for him. And it did not care. He fought. He tried to hold on to himself, to be, but how could he resist something that was older than time? Something that had existed before thought, before stars, before anything? His memories blurred. His thoughts unwrote themselves. He was. He had been. He. Enough. A voice, clear and sharp, cut through the unraveling. Raska's essence snapped back, solidifying once more. He gasped, though he had no lungs, his presence anchoring against the tide of nothingness. The woman stood before him. She was no longer bound. No longer small. No longer just human. Her eyes were black as the void, but within them, galaxies swirled. Stars were born and destroyed in the span of seconds. Her presence was wrong, something the Silent Ones could not touch, could not consume. They recoiled from her, shifting in agitation. Raska tried to speak, but words were meaningless here. She understood anyway. They would have taken you, she said, her voice a vibration through his very being. But I won't let them. The Silent Ones trembled. Not in fear, but in acknowledgement. In resentment. You are not one of us. Their voices scraped against the fabric of the void, a statement directed at her. No, she agreed. But you owe me a debt. A pause. The darkness rippled. You have no claim. I do, she countered. You came for me first. You touched my mind. That was your mistake. The shadows twisted in agitation. The air, or the lack of it, throbbed with unseen energy. What do you demand? She turned toward Raska. Him. The whispers hissed. He is already unmade. Then make him again. A deep, resonant silence followed. The kind that stretched into eternity. The Silent Ones did not give. They only took. But she was not asking. She was telling. The shadows pulsed, once, twice, then recoiled. And Raska fell. He awoke with a gasp. Cold air burned his lungs. His body was real, solid. He was sprawled on the metallic floor of a ship that was no longer breaking apart. The black dagger. Hull. Lights flickered overhead. Warning alarms blared softly in the background, but the ship was intact. No more whispering. No more things in the dark. He wasn't alone. Grenth groaned beside him, rubbing his head. What the hell just happened? Raska pushed himself up, eyes scanning the bridge. The consoles were functional, the viewport showed the vast emptiness of space, nothing unnatural, nothing waiting. It was as if none of it had happened. But it had. Because she was still there. The woman stood at the helm, her gaze fixed on the void beyond the glass. She was different now, something beneath her skin, something greater than what she had been before. Raska rose to his feet, his voice hoarse. What are you? She turned to him, her expression unreadable. Something new. A long silence passed between them. Then she said, I warned you. You should have let me go. Raska exhaled sharply. You could have killed us all. Let them take us. She tilted her head. I could have. But you didn't. A small smile touched her lips. No. I didn't. Raska crossed his arms, studying her. Why? Her gaze flickered, something almost human behind those void dark eyes. Because I remember what it was like to be powerless. She turned away. And I refused to be that ever again. Without another word, she walked toward the exit, pausing only once at the threshold. They'll leave you alone now, she said. For a while. For a while? Grenth repeated, his voice wary. She looked over her shoulder. They never forget, Captain. And then she was gone. Rasker and Grenth stood in silence, the weight of what had happened settling over them. Finally, Grenth muttered, "We are never taking a human hostage again." Rasker let out a dry, humorless laugh. Agreed. He turned toward the console, setting coordinates for the farthest system he could think of. Because the woman was right. The Silent Ones wouldn't forget. And neither would he.